Firstly, it's not clear to me whether this town of Mercouris, if it is indeed fully qualifies as a town, suburb of Kiev perhaps would be more proper, a proper way to describe it. Well, it's far from clear to me that it was ever actually captured by the Russians. And I actually saw a Ukrainian report saying that the Russians had been repelled, which suggested that instead of the Ukrainians recapturing it, they'd actually pushed back a Russian attack on Mercouris. Anyway, that's the first. The events in Nikolaev are seen as nothing more than tactical positioning on a front that is largely static. And as for the fighting in ETHEREUM, well, there's been no real discussion of that on the Russian side either. Now, that could very well be because the Russians are indeed losing ground there, but it could equally be because the Russians have actually pushed apparently further south from ETHEREUM, circumventing the Ukrainian defenders who are still clinging on in some parts of the town's southern suburbs. Other Russian reports, by the way, speak of the Ukrainian forces, both in ETHEREUM and elsewhere, starting to pull back towards the easterly cities of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, perhaps intending to set up some kind of hedgehog defense there, in which case it would suggest that the Ukrainian counterattack in ETHEREUM isn't going particularly well. Well, I'm not on the ground. I only have access to open sources. I can speak sometimes to people who believe themselves to be well informed, but I can never gauge exactly what the truth is of what they say. But overall, my general impression is that yesterday, despite these claims by the Ukrainians of victory, the Russians and their allies, the militia of the two Donbass republics and the Chechen irregular forces which have joined them, continue to make headway where, as far as they're concerned, it matters. So it seems that their area of control in Mariupol has increased. There's some reports that they now control up to 70% of the city. This has gone up from the 50% that was the case a day earlier. And there's also some reports that the Ukrainian forces in Mariupol are now desperately short of supplies, including fresh water, that resistance there is increasingly cracking, and that the Ukrainian forces risk being divided into two parts, as the militia, the Donbass militia, which along with the Chechens seems to be doing most of the fighting in Mariupol, punches its way through to the sea. Well, again, of course, I can't confirm any of this, but it does seem consistent with the information that I'm seeing. And furthermore, it seems that elsewhere in the Donbass, the Russians and their allies continue incrementally to follow through with their objectives of breaking up and encircling the Ukrainian forces in the Donbass, which, to repeat again, are the most important part of the Ukrainian army. I've actually now seen a report, a Russian report. I want to stress again, it is a Russian report. Of course, I cannot vouch for its accuracy, that one of the purposes of the Russian troops in and around Kiev is to divert the Ukrainians and divide them. In other words, to prevent the Ukrainians concentrating all their forces in the main front, which is in Donbass, but instead to disperse them across their huge country, defending places like Kiev, which are not actually directly threatened, Kiev and Kharkiv and all of the rest. That allows the Russians and their allies to defeat the Ukrainians in detail. In other words, to take one part of the Ukrainian armed forces after another. I'm also getting further reports, by the way, from Russian sources. Again, I cannot vouch for their accuracy, that contrary to what is being said in some sections of the media, the rate of casualties that the Russians have been experiencing has actually been steadily falling. The highest losses were suffered over the first 3 days of the operation, as one might have expected, with large columns of troops moving rapidly across country, obviously exposed to local counterattacks and ambushes. But now, with this much more methodical war being fought, that casualties that the Russians are experiencing have radically fallen, and that at the same time, with lots of drones operating across the battlefield, and with Russian aircraft now engaging in close air support over Donbass, that the situation has become more transparent to the Russian military, and that they're able to track and intercept and sometimes destroy Ukrainian formations more efficiently than they could previously. Again, these are Russian claims. I can't confirm them one way or the other. One thing that does seem to be true, however, is that it does seem that these various strikes that the Russians have been launching, long-range missile strikes against Ukrainian ammunition and fuel depots, are indeed causing a crisis of supply across the Ukrainian military. Apparently, the Ukrainian ambassador in London has admitted as much, and that the Ukrainians are rapidly running out of ammunition and weapon systems and fuel, and that this is now starting to have a real impact on their abilities to keep defending. Well, again, I think that's fairly reliable. I would add that perhaps an even more serious problem would probably be fresh water. That's my own guess. Obviously, they can take water from the civilian supply system, but I suspect if you have large numbers of men in the field, that probably isn't an adequate way to keep them fresh, and it may very well be that there are problems with water supply as well. I have heard that the Ukrainian forces in Mariupol are suffering from a lack of water supply, especially. Lastly, whilst we're talking about military developments, there was an article which I finally read in the US media, which is sourced on information from the Pentagon, which admitted that for the first time, that if the Russians haven't launched the kind of all-out bombing war that the US engages in when at the start of every one of its wars, this is not through lack of capability, it is through choice. Now, the article then veers off into all kinds of, I think, misconceived speculations as to the reasons for this. But the fact that it finally acknowledges that it is the Russians' deliberate choice to avoid engaging in a bombing campaign is in itself, I suppose, a progress. What I would say about this is that US wars against, to a great extent, Vietnam, though there was a lot of ground fighting there too, but certainly against Iraq, Yugoslavia, Libya, and other places, Afghanistan, have tended overwhelmingly to be bombing wars. The US has tended to avoid sending its ground forces into battle against conventional opposing armies. At least it has avoided doing that until those armies have been bombed extremely heavily to the point where it's expected or assumed that their capacity to keep fighting is going to be severely degraded. And I think that means that the US has some difficulty understanding a war like the war the Russians are fighting in Ukraine, which the Russians have chosen to fight instead more like a conventional ground war. And of course, you can argue why the Russians have gone for a ground war instead of a bombing war. And I have said many times, I think it is largely because of Russian military and operational philosophies. But I would simply add that these American wars have never had good outcomes. They've always ultimately left the greater part of the enemy's forces in being. So in Afghanistan, the Taliban were able to melt away into their villages and then reorganize and come back on the offensive. In Iraq, Saddam Hussein's army eventually dispersed. Many of its members then joined all kinds of paramilitary organizations like IS and caused the United States endless trouble. In Libya, it's been much the same story. And of course, in Yugoslavia, in the case of Yugoslavia, the bombing war did actually very little damage to the Yugoslav army, which remains intact and still a powerful force in the Balkans. So these bombing wars that the United States has waged have never been fully successful. Of course, in Vietnam, where there was a mix of a bombing war and a conventional war, the bombing war, which was of a scale that had never been seen before, at least not since the Korean War, failed completely in its eventual objective, which is the destruction of the North Vietnamese army. It could not prevent the North Vietnamese army battling all its way to Saigon and eventually taking the city in 1975. So the story of US bombing wars is that they may look dramatic, they may appear to achieve very quick results, but if the objective is complete victory, however that is defined, then they've been far less successful. Who's to say that the Russian approach, incrementally dismantling the enemy's army through encirclements and battles, causing the enemy to feel that they have actually been defeated in war, gradually dismantling their capacity to keep on resisting, who's to say that that will not ultimately prove more successful? I would add that if we are looking at what many people consider to be the most successful of the latest US bombing wars, which is the war the US fought against Iraq in 1991, the bombing war there went on for something like 2 months before the ground forces initiated any kind of offensive. And that, of course, is longer than the entire battle that has so far taken place in Ukraine itself. Most objective analysts that I have seen feel that this war in Ukraine will probably be decided in April. We're not that far from April yet. We will see whether they are right. Anyway, that seems to me to be as reasonably objective an assessment of the state of events on the ground in Ukraine as I can make. I can't obviously vouch for its total accuracy. As I've said many times, I'm not a military man, I'm not a tactician or a strategist. I have limited understanding of weapon systems and of wars and of tactics. But it seems to me that when one looks at the maps, when one compares the various reports, what I've described is probably the closest approximation to what is going on that one can objectively make at this time. Anyway, let's turn to other things. The President of the United States, Joe Biden, is now coming to Europe. He's going to have a whole series of meetings in Brussels with European officials from NATO and from the European Union. There's talk about more sanctions against Russia. There's unclear what the form of those sanctions is going to be. The Germans and other Europeans are apparently resisting attempts to extend the sanctions to include Russian energy exports. And there have now been admissions by people in the Daily Telegraph, Ambrose, Evans, Pritchard, as I discussed in my previous programme, that the sanctions that have been imposed so far on the Russians aren't succeeding. So, of course, the temptation to escalate, to impose more sanctions, may now grow. We shall just have to wait and see. But anyway, it's been striking to see how up to now the United States and its allies have become increasingly frustrated at the way in which their sanctions war has been going. Now, I say that because it's quite clear to me that things are not turning out here at all as was expected. When the sanctions against the Russian Central Bank were unrolled a few weeks ago, I'm absolutely sure, in fact, I'm completely sure, and this was based on statements that US officials made, including our old friend, the senior administration official, in an anonymous briefing that he gave to the White House press team, and which can still be found on the White House website, that the intention was to cause the Russian financial system to implode, to tip Russia into hyperinflation, and thereby to provoke a political crisis which would cause regime change in Moscow. That was the plan. Well, things have not worked out as expected. The ruble has not gone into free fall. The financial system in Russia continues to operate. More parts of it now are incrementally reopening. And rather alarmingly, as I am making this program, President Putin is now talking about the need for Western countries to start paying for imports of Russian gas and oil in rubles. Now, I think the last is an important development, but as I don't yet have the full text of President Putin's comments, then that is something I'm going to discuss in more detail, probably on the DURAN with my colleagues Alex Christoforou, but no doubt also to some extent on this channel, when I know more clearly what Putin said and what the intentions are. And what this means is that the Western powers, I think something to their surprise, and I suspect in the case of some of the European states, to their growing concern, are now finding themselves in a war of economic attrition that they didn't plan for, and which they're not prepared for, and which they haven't really got a clear idea how to wage. So there's been an interesting article in Politico, which all but admits always these articles which come out in Western journals should be taken with some degree of skepticism because they come with a lot of political baggage. But anyway, it admits that the European plan to wean themselves off of Russian energy, certainly to 2/3 levels within a year, that these plans are unrealistic. It says that US LNG exports are now at absolute capacity and that they cannot be increased further, and that President Biden, when he comes to Europe, is going to find it impossible to enlarge on promises to ramp up LNG exports beyond the point that they've already reached. Robert Habeck, the German economics minister, went to Qatar, which is another major producer of liquefied natural gas, LNG. There were all sorts of glowing articles and headlines in the Financial Times and elsewhere that said that Habeck had negotiated with Qatar long-term deals for LNG supply by Qatar. The trouble is, when one actually looks at what the various officials on both sides said, it's clear that there's been no long-term commitment or agreement of any kind. Clearly, all that happened was that Habeck had a conversation with the Qataris, over the course of which the Qataris said that yes, they would be happy to sell more LNG to the Europeans if the Europeans were prepared to pay the right price, but that this will have to be negotiated by the relevant companies. So clearly there's been no long-term agreement. clearly negotiations are going to have to take place. These negotiations could last weeks, months, years even, and even then it's most unlikely that even these supplies from Qatar would come anywhere close to resolving the energy deficit caused by a cut-off of Russian pipeline gas to Europe. I would add anyway that all this talk about diverting LNG from the United States and indeed Qatar to Europe misses the very important point that LNG, liquefied natural gas, operates within a global market. If liquefied natural gas is going to Europe, then by definition less of it is going to Asia. And unless the Asians start to buy more Russian pipeline gas, then LNG prices inevitably are going to rise, leaving Europeans paying more for their gas, and by the way, Asians too. Of course, it is highly likely, in fact, it is a certainty, that the Asians will replace any Qatari or American LNG which used to come to them with Russian LNG from the Arctic and quite possibly Russian pipeline gas in the case of the Chinese and perhaps in time the Indians. But of course that defeats the whole point. It simply means that there's just going to be a rearrangement in the global energy markets, so that what will happen is that the Europeans will be buying more expensive LNG, which is inherently more expensive than pipeline gas, and it will be the Asians instead, with their much bigger industrial economies, the Chinese first and foremost, the Indians perhaps before long, who will be benefiting from the cheaper Russian pipeline gas. But anyway, that's where we are on that front. Of course, if Putin follows through on his decision to insist on payment of Russian gas and oil in rubles, well, then we'll see what effect that has on the European energy market as well. I would have thought that would be a difficult thing politically for the Europeans to agree to. But since they have no realistic choice but to buy Russian oil and gas, at least for the time being, they may be obliged to do it, in which case they could end up supporting the ruble and perhaps, and rather more dangerously from an American perspective, internationalizing the ruble as an international currency similar to the dollar, the euro, the pound sterling and the yen. And that, of course, would not be a good thing from an American perspective at all. Of course, it isn't just energy, it's also food, it's also metals, which are now apparently in increasing short supply. There's also major uncertainties about what's going to happen in the financial system. And there's also reports when we come to oil specifically that there are major shortages now of diesel oil, and it's quite likely that we could see critical shortages of diesel oil over the course of the next few weeks, with talk about rationing. And in fact, it's most extraordinary. It's really very alarming to see how the talk about rationing, about introducing rationing in energy supplies, perhaps in other supplies, is now spreading across the West. And again, I wonder whether the political leaders who embarked on this sanctions war fully understood its implications, and whether they had realized that it could very well end up in the kind of outcomes like rationing that we might very well be seeing. Of course, if the US follows up on the threats that Blinken was making yesterday, which I discussed in my previous video, and if they do start now to sanction China as well, well, all these problems are going to multiply by orders of magnitude. Meanwhile, there's been some really grumpy comments from US officials, including President Biden, complaining about India's failure to condemn the Russians and India's continued policy of working with Russia on a commercial basis. And there's been similar grumbles, by the way, about other countries, including South Africa. Well, if, of course, we now start in a sanctions war campaign against them also, things are going to become extremely difficult. Meanwhile, we've just had a further inflation readout in Britain. Inflation in Britain is now at 6.2% as of the end of February and is probably rising with the price surges in Britain, no doubt accelerating. We're going to see another big increase in inflation in March and almost certainly a further one in April when the caps on household energy prices start to get lifted and household bills, energy bills increase in Britain by around 50%. So Britain at least seems to be heading for much higher inflation. So I suspect is the European Union, and so of course is the United States. This crisis, this sanctions war, this economic war of attrition, which the Western powers have maneuvered themselves into, has come at an extraordinarily difficult time. We had the pressures on the global economy caused by the pandemic and the lockdowns. Then we had the incredibly ill-judged and misconceived policy followed by the Biden administration in its first year of trying to turbocharge American growth by increasing spending, by running an even bigger budget deficit, and by persisting with QE. And that resulted in very high inflation in the United States and indeed globally. And now, of course, on top of that, we have this ill-thought-out economic war of attrition against the Russians, which we are in the West not prepared for, and which is causing inflation to rise even further. I wonder how we get out of this. I wonder what we do. And I wonder whether anything breaks in the meantime. Well, as to that, we will see. I'm going to make one further prediction. If the war does indeed end in April, if there is some kind of political settlement imposed on Ukraine by the Russians, or if Ukraine breaks down, which is possible, by the way, if something like that does happen, then no doubt there will be another wave of anger and hysteria in the West. But from that moment on, it will all begin to abate and die down. At that point, people in Europe, in the United States, elsewhere,